Hello and welcome to lecture number 6. Today's topic, the Industrial Revolution. A few themes will be addressed in this presentation. First of all, we're going to look at how and why the Industrial Revolution began. In fact, one of the things that we're going to see is that there had to be an agricultural revolution first. We'll also focus on why the revolution began in England itself. Then we'll explore some positives and negatives associated with industrialization, and then how people responded. People in England took a unique step. They began to form unions. A first step in the industrial process dealt with population. We'll see a huge increase in the population of several European nations. I'd like to begin with some statistics. Europe experienced a population explosion beginning in the 1700s and continuing to 1900. In 1730, Europe's population was at about 120 million. It was at 190 million by 1800, by 1850, 265 million, and by 1900, about 400 million. You may wonder, well, what accounted for this major increase in population? There was a major decline in death rates as people began to live longer, largely due to a better diet and more access to food. Europe experienced an agricultural revolution. One factor that influenced this was the availability of new crops. The Columbian Exchange helps to explain some of these new crops. Yes, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 and he brought many items common in Europe to the New World. However, many New World plants also were brought back to Europe. Here we see a range of plants brought from Europe back to the Americas, from apples and beets, olives and sugarcane, to grapefruit and other items. Items that were common in the Americas are shown here. Beans and corn, pumpkins and squash, tomatoes, sweet potato and white potatoes. These offered more variety to people's diets in Europe, and it also added nutrition. Additionally, there were new technologies that were applied to agriculture. I'd like to mention two individuals who were very important and influential. The first person is shown here. His name was Jethro Tull. Have you ever heard of the band Jethro Tull? Its lead singer and flautist is Ian Anderson. He's shown here on the right. They got the name for the band after this famous agriculturalist from England. Jethro Tull was a farmer in England. His goal was to try to increase the crop production on the land that he had. He experimented with a wide range of different techniques. One of the things that he invented, or at least popularized, was a seed drill. You see some images of the seed drill, as well as someone using a seed drill on the right. Another English farmer was shown here. His name was Charles Townsend. His nickname was Turnip Townsend because he loved turnips and he advocated their use so much. He also was a member of Parliament. First of all, he popularized the use of items like clover, peas, and beans. These are legumes. They have an impact on the soil. They add nitrogen to the soil. This is necessary because things like barley and wheat and oats take nitrogen from the soil. He also encouraged people to plant alfalfa and turnips. These were fodder. Now you might be saying to yourself, what in the world is fodder? Well, here's a textbook definition. It's a crop that's produced basically to feed animals. Because the turnips and the alfalfa were used as fodder and they helped to add nutrients to the soil, this provided a lot more food for livestock, and it made cattle and pigs and other livestock affordable for people because they could afford to then feed their animals. This helped to add variety to people's diet and added protein. This had a huge impact on shaping the agricultural revolution. Turnip Townsend was innovative in other ways as well. He encouraged people to rotate their crops with the legumes and their traditional crops like oats and barley, and he advocated the use of manure. With more livestock, that they produced more manure, which, when added to the soil, added additional nutrients, which expanded or increased people's crop yields. I hope you don't mind, but again, I'm going to return to some statistics. In 1700, about 80% of the people living in Europe farmed. 100 years later, as some of these techniques had been implemented, about 40% of Europe's population farmed. And they produced more food, and at a lower cost. This had a huge impact on society. Next, we'll look at some factors which help to explain why the Industrial Revolution began in the British Isles. The factory system and the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain because they had a variety of advantages. One dealt with the abundance of natural resources. The south and the eastern part of England had tremendous farmland, so they were able to produce enough food for people to eat. There were also rich coal and iron reserves as well. This map helps to identify some of the locations of the rich coal deposits. The arrows in this map point to Newcastle, Sheffield, and then in southern Wales, where some of those natural coal deposits were located. Coal was the fuel that really powered this phase of the Industrial Revolution. It was used to create steam for steam engines, and also helped to produce iron and then steel. England's proximity to the sea also was a big advantage. In an era when water transport offered the best means for transporting bulk commodities, the proximity to the sea helped it tremendously. England also had a stable political system. In contrast to France, where they had a revolution in the late 1700s, England's revolution and civil war was in the 1600s. For the 1700s and 1800s, it had a relatively stable political system, so this was an advantage. Lastly, England had a very large colonial empire. This allowed it to acquire many raw materials. This map identifies the major colonies established by European nations in Africa. The red indicate colonies that the British had. The key locations would be South Africa, Egypt, and Nigeria. These regions provided raw materials, particularly cotton in Egypt, as well as diamonds in South Africa. These were tremendous advantages for the British. This map identifies the colonies that European nations had in Asia. Have you ever heard the statement, "The sun never set on the British Empire"? Well, the Brits had colonies in India as well as Australia. Silk was the raw material that the British were able to acquire because of their empire in India. This was a tremendous advantage that they had. The British had factories where they transformed raw cotton into t-shirts, pants, or other pieces of clothing. Another area where they received raw cotton was the American South in the years prior to the American Civil War. You can see the figures here demonstrating the tremendous increase in the imports that the British had of American cotton over the years. The Industrial Revolution transformed society in many ways. There were both positives as well as negatives associated with it. We'll explore both next. In many ways, the Eiffel Tower, located in the city of Paris, came to symbolize the successes of the industrial movement. This structure, made entirely of steel, was 1,063 feet high. Of course, the year 1889 was significant. It was 100 years after the start of the French Revolution. Well, I'd like to digress here for one moment. A few years ago, I went on a trip to Europe with my family. We went back to visit our exchange student, Christiana, and we traveled up to the Eiffel Tower. We only made it about halfway up, but it was really amazing. It just dominates the skyline in the city of Paris. I do have to admit something, though. It's actually kind of ugly. I know it sounds crazy, but it's dark and it's steel. And the people in Paris love it today, but they didn't initially. When it's lit up at night, it's really awesome, but in a way, it's also kind of ugly. One of the major positives associated with the Industrial Revolution dealt with the textile industry and clothing. Prior to the 1750s, most average people made their own clothes. The rich could afford to have someone make it for them. However, most people would get raw cloth and sew it themselves. The Industrial Revolution changed that. Do you remember this slide from an earlier presentation? One of the steps toward industrialization was when many women would spin wool and men would weave yarn in large looms in their homes. This was a way for people to make a little bit of extra money, particularly in the winter months. Well, steam power was applied to those looms, and one loom with two people working it could produce as much as 20 weavers at the same time. This brought the cost of cloth down, and even poor people began to be able to afford prefabricated clothing. They called them prefabs. They came in all sorts of sizes, like small, medium, and large. Again, this transformed clothing, and even poor people could afford to purchase their clothes, and they didn't have to make it themselves. Transportation was transformed during the Industrial Revolution as well. The best example would be seen with the railroads. The first locomotive is shown here. It didn't transport people. Instead, it pulled coal trains. This was called the Puffing Billy. Just think, if you could transport goods on something like this, you could get things from spot A to spot B much more quickly, and you could pull heavy loads at the same time. This drawing shows the Rocket. It was one of the first passenger railroads, and it went at a staggering speed of 14 miles an hour. The first passengers went from Liverpool to Manchester. By 1851, there were 7,000 miles of railroad track linking different parts of Great Britain. They transported people, raw materials, and food products all over the British Isles. Now, this painting represents some of the differences between first-class and second-class railroad cars on the passenger line from Liverpool to Manchester. Notice the top. Okay? Those are first-class cars. There's a cover over the top of them, and people would put their luggage on the top of the rail cars themselves. The bottom shows the second-class cars. Notice if there's no cover. If it rained, they got wet. I wanted to mention a couple of other things as well. Health was impacted by many new products which became cheaper and more available to people. Soap was mass-produced. Cheap cotton underwear became a boon for people who wanted to keep clean. Iron pipes and brick construction also made it easy enough for people to have indoor plumbing. Sugar, tea, and meat, which traditionally had been available only to the very rich, became available to commoners by the mid-1800s. There were also many negatives associated with industrialization, including very poor working conditions. This political cartoon from this era demonstrates the changes in society. At the very top, you see wealthy people being waited on. They've got really nice homes and luxurious chairs, and they're eating expensive foods. On the bottom, you see really poor people. They've all been exploited. They're working in horrible conditions in factories, and they're the foundation of society. They're stuck in coal mines. Children are working, as well as old people. So here we see a strong dichotomy between the rich and the poor. Do you remember this from a previous presentation? When people worked in the guilds, They could often set their own pace. Yes, they would have to work hard, they would have to fill all their orders, but if you wanted to work really hard for an hour and a half in the morning, and then take a little bit of a break, and then work really hard again a little bit later, you could do that. These often were small, family businesses with only 8, 10, maybe 12 people who worked in them. You could also take pride in your work. You started with an order, you would start making a particular product from the beginning, the middle, and you would see it as a finished product. You could take pride and say, hey, I started off with a piece of leather, or I started with a piece of cloth, and I transformed that into a boot or maybe a nice suit. This image shows hatters making felt hats. Working in a factory was completely different. The work schedule was determined by the clock and the whistle. The whistle went off when you had to be at your station. The clock also determined when you could go to the bathroom and when you could quit for the day. These days were long. Today, we think of an 8-hour day as a typical workday. Back then, and up to the mid-1840s, 12 to 16 hours a day was common. These were also huge factories. There might be 250, even 300 workers in one of these large structures. These drawings show some typical textile factories. This is where they made clothing in Manchester, England. As you can see, these factories averaged about 300 employees, many of whom were women. You know, something like 80 or 90% of the workers in these textile factories were female. Whether someone worked in a factory or a coal mine, often these were horrible conditions. People became despondent, and in some cases, because there was very little hope for advancement, abuse of alcohol became more common. Coal was the fuel that drove this phase of the Industrial Revolution, much like oil and gasoline today. On the left, you see coal being loaded onto cars. On the right, you see men descending down a mine shaft. Sometimes they would have to go several hundred feet beneath the Earth's surface, where dangerous gases and explosions could lead to fatalities. They often brought canaries with them in order to test the air to make sure that it was okay for them to keep working. If the canary died, they needed to get out and they needed to go right away. Women and children had always worked on farms. It's just that family units had worked. Mom and Dad and Susie and Johnny, let's just say, all worked together. Well, children as well as women worked in these factories. Up until 1833, there were very few restrictions on child labor, and at that point, children under the age of 9 were prohibited from working. But that meant that if you were 9 or older, you could still work. On the right, we see many women working in a factory in the late 1800s. This had a major impact on marriages and family life. Boys who were 10 or 12 years old often were employed as trolley boys. Here you see them chained to coal carts in narrow passages. In some cases, these might weigh 250 to 600 pounds. This painting seemed to embody some of the problems associated with society. The name of it was Gin Lane. The slogan was, "Get drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2 pence," which wasn't much money. Notice the woman in the center. She's so drunk, she's dropping her baby. This was one of the problems with society as alcoholism grew. The standard of living for many increased as a result of the Industrial Revolution, but in other cases, there was a negative aspect and there were poor living conditions. So again, that contrast between the rich and the poor continued. With all of those factories using coal-fired furnaces all the time, it seemed as if there was a dust over everything, and many aspects of England and other areas that were industrialized would have a thick, heavy smoke and smog that dominated the skyline. This led to lung problems that people had, whether it's asthma or others, but this had a big impact on people's living conditions. As people began to congregate in large urban areas to work in those factories, they could put pressure on the water system. Florence Nightingale became famous as a nurse during the Crimean War, but she also began to investigate access to water. This painting here identifies Death's Dispensary, as a water source could become contaminated and could spread diseases like tuberculosis, cholera, or other things. People responded in a variety of ways to the problems that they faced during the Industrial Revolution. We'll look first at mass movements. Did anyone happen to see the movie or the play Les Miserables? Well, this does a great job of showing a mass movement in France. Now, I'm not going to talk about this so much. However, when you're done with the presentation, maybe you want to click on one of the hyperlinks that are on the Canvas site so that you can see this preview for the movie Les Miserables. In England, at about the same time, another mass movement was led by this man, William Lovett. His goal was to expand democracy. He eventually emerged as the leader of the Chartist movement. The Chartists hoped to establish a variety of changes that they wanted to see which would improve society. The first was universal manhood suffrage. This meant that they want all men to have the right to vote. They also supported the secret ballot. In this era, voting was a very public affair. Once you voted, everybody knew if you voted for the first candidate or the second candidate. And so the Chartist movement wanted to change the voting system so that more people could vote, but also so that there would be a secret ballot so your neighbor wouldn't know exactly who it was that you voted for, or maybe your boss wouldn't know. Another goal was to eliminate property qualifications for serving in Parliament. This would allow working class people the opportunity to serve. In the 1830s, the Chartist movement was unable to get the passage of any of these proposals. However, over time, they all were put into place. Let's see if we can summarize some of the main concepts included in the presentation. First of all, the presentation addressed how and why the Industrial Revolution began, particularly in England. It also focused on the actions of key individuals who shaped it. The revolution had a positive and negative impact on people's lives. And people reacted in different ways. One thing you want to keep in mind is, do you think the changes were positive or negative for the people living in Europe? Well, that's it for today. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you found it interesting. Have a good day, and we'll see you online.